A few years ago, my brother got me this for Christmas, the Mayflash F300. It's an entry-level arcade stick that mainly appeals to fans of fighting games, though I mainly have it to play classic arcade games I have on my consoles. This product has been around for years, almost a decade even. They've made updated versions of it, but the F300 is fairly the more affordable option. This stick is compatible with the following consoles: PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Xbox 360, Windows, Android, Neo Geo Mini, Sega Astro City Mini, and most importantly, both Nintendo Switch 1 and 2. This isn't really a review on this product, but if you want to know more about this product and how you can modify it like I did, I highly recommend watching Joystick and Wise's videos on the product. I've tested this arcade stick on my PS3 with the Namco Museum games for the PS1. I even beat the original Pac-Man world with this. I also tested on my Xbox 360 with Namco Museum Virtual Arcade and even Street Fighter 4. Lastly, I tested on my Nintendo Switch with the various Arcade Archives titles. While I had since upgraded my system to the Nintendo Switch 2, the arcade stick still works great on that system just like its predecessor. Since I often associate Pac-Man with arcades, I did a test around the time Pac-Man Museum Plus came out, because I wanted to see how it worked with the collection. Now, the version of the Mayflash F300 my brother bought on eBay was used, which explains why the original buttons had been replaced with higher quality Sanwa buttons. However, because the stick was released before the Switch, there's no display of the button layout for Nintendo. As a way for me to indicate the button layout for the Switch, I swapped out some of the buttons to match the color button layout for the Super Famicom controller. The joystick, on the other hand, was still a stock part, and was stuck on an 8-way square restrictor gate. The classic Pac-Man games use a 4-way square gate, so if you want to play Pac-Man with the stick, I highly advise replacing the stock joystick with a Sanwa joystick, as well as a 5-pin cable. What's cool about Sanwa's joysticks is that their square restrictor gate can be rotated to change it from 8-way to 4-way. So make sure you do that if it's going to be your dedicated Pac-Man controller. So now that the joystick was fully modified and ready for some Pac-Man action, let's see how well the Mayflash F300 works with all 14 games from Pac-Man Museum Plus. Of course, since I modded my joystick to be 4-way, you'll probably expect the final verdict for at least some of these games. One thing I despise about the arcade games, minus Pac-Man's border art using the midway designs, is the fact that there is no way to change the settings for the arcade games. Which might not be a deal breaker for most people, but it is a huge negative for me who prefers playing these games with 5 lives or having the chance to continue in Pac-Mania. I get they probably didn't want players cheating on the missions, but still, that's one aspect I prefer about the Arcade Archives releases. I also heard people complain about input lag on some of these games, but I never really noticed it. But I did notice some audio issues in the old arcade games. I know this sounds like I hate this collection, I don't. I just find it baffling that they didn't give you the chance to change the settings on some of these games, or even change the border art, which in my opinion, made the whole collection leave a lot to be desired. Say what you will about Super Mario 3D All-Stars, but at least I knew what I was expecting from that collection, which wasn't much, but at least the games weren't missing any crucial settings. This still, however, doesn't change the fact that Pac-Man Museum Plus is still a solid collection, especially if you're looking forward to playing Championship Edition or Battle Royale. Pac-Man is still a fantastic game as always, and while it's no Arcade Archives and is missing its game settings, it's still a solid version of the game. Playing Pac-Man with the Mayflash F300 is of course playable. Super Pac-Man is next, and it's kinda strange that the cabinet design and border art in this collection use the midway aesthetics but with the proper Namco designs. Why the original Pac-Man didn't do this, we may never know. As for the action button on the arcade stick, keep in mind that for the Switch version, the A button is placed differently from the Xbox's A button. So the A button for this arcade stick is where the Xbox's B button is usually at. This is the case for almost all the games that have an action button. Kind of annoying if you ask me. It's also like this on PS4. Not sure about Xbox One though. You might be asking why I didn't just remap the buttons on the Switch 2 menu. Well, it's because I can't. Anyways, aside from liking the game settings, Super Pac-Man is still great to play, and like its predecessor, is indeed playable with the F300. Pac-N-Pal is up next, and the same thing about the previous two apply to this game. It's playable with the F300. Now, Pac-Land is where things get a bit iffy, and it's not the arcade stick's fault. Because Pac-Man Museum Plus doesn't have button remapping, you're forced to move Pac-Man with the joystick, which is very cumbersome and not how the original developers wanted you to play the game. You're supposed to move Pac-Man by mashing down the buttons, a la track and field. I'd say Pac-Land is playable with the F300, but I wouldn't recommend it as it's not how the original developers intended. For a more authentic controller, use the directional buttons on either version of the left Joy-Con. If you wish to still play Pac-Land with the arcade stick, you're way better off buying the game on Arcade Archives. Pac-Mania plays exactly how I expected. Still sucks that there's no option to continue after game over, but otherwise it's completely playable on the F300. Pac-Attack is an interesting case. While Museum Plus uses the original Super Nintendo version, there was an arcade release of it. It just wasn't a Pac-Man game. It was originally part of the Cosmo Gang franchise under the title Cosmo Gang: The Puzzle. It started out in arcades in 1992 and was ported to the Super Famicom a year later. Around the same time, it was released internationally for the Super Nintendo, but rebranded as a Pac-Man game called Pac-Attack. So because of its arcade origins, playing Pac-Attack with the Mayflash F300 felt pretty right at home. It's playable for sure. Pac-in-Time is another Pac-Man rebranded game. It originally started out as an unrelated game for the Amiga and MS-DOS, called Fury of the Furries. Namco got the license to release the game for the Super Nintendo and rebranded as a Pac-Man game. However, since this was originally meant to be a computer game, playing Pac-in-Time with an arcade stick was odd to say the least. I feel you're probably better off using the Nintendo Switch Online's Super Nintendo controller instead, or any of its third-party alternatives, but otherwise, with the F300, Pac-in-Time was at least playable. Pac-Man Arrangement Arcade Edition is my personal favorite 2D Pac-Man game. There's new graphics, mazes, kinky, and some power-up capsules. Other than that, the gameplay is pretty much identical to the original Pac-Man. Since all the 2D Pac-Man games play exactly how they should with the Mayflash F300, the arcade version of Pac-Man Arrangement is no different. It's playable. The console version of Pac-Man Arrangement is a similar story. Since the mechanics are like other 2D games, it's playable. Pac-Man Championship Edition is the exact same story. It's playable. Pac-Motos is a simple remake of the arcade game Motos. It's a bumper car style game where you knock enemies off the board. Simple stuff, but really fun. Unfortunately, Motos used an 8-way joystick due to its use of diagonal movement, so the 4-way Sanwa joystick is not ideal. Funnily enough, it can still register diagonal movement, just not very easily. You can change the Sanwa joystick's square restrictor gate back to 8-way to make the gameplay more authentic. If your Mayflash F300 still had its stock 8-way joystick, then this is pretty much the only game in that collection that works perfectly with it. So whether you're using the stock joystick or if your Sanwa joystick is set to 8-way, Pac-Motos is playable with the F300. Pac-N-Roll Remix is essentially a remake of the DS game Pac-N-Roll, except without the game's story cutscenes. Playing this with the arcade stick was even stranger than Pac-in-Time. Regardless if I have the Sanwa joystick set to either 4-way or 8-way, playing Pac-N-Roll Remix with the arcade stick proved to be more difficult than just using the analog stick. I could totally see this game working with an arcade stick had this joystick used an octagon restrictor gate. Also unrelated, but I would like to see how this game would work with a trackball. Overall, I can't imagine someone wanting to use an arcade stick for something like Pac-N-Roll Remix. I mean, the original game was meant to be played on a stylus for crying out loud. Overall, even on 8-way, I found this game to be unplayable with the F300. Pac-Man Battle Royale plays exactly like the other 2D Pac-Man games. Also, could you imagine buying 3 more arcade sticks just to have your friends and family play together as the original developers intended? Depending on the prices of Mayflash's products, I imagine it would be extremely expensive, especially since if I wanted my family to play with me, we'd be better off going to our local movie theater instead. Sorry I went on a bit of a tangent, but yeah, Pac-Man Battle Royale is playable with the arcade stick. Pac-Man 256 is another game you expect to play well with the arcade stick, and you'd be correct. I remember the days when I played it on my old Amazon Fire TV, though the Amazon remote did make things a little cumbersome after a while. Luckily, Pac-Man 256 is much more improved than Museum Plus, and is completely playable with the F300 arcade stick. Overall, the Mayflash F300 is a great arcade stick for Pac-Man Museum Plus, just as long as you use a Sanwa joystick and set its restrictor gate to 4-way. Of all the 14 games in the collection, only one of them was unplayable, which was Pac-N-Roll Remix. Pac-Land was the only game that was playable with the stick, but not recommended due to its different gameplay style. This means that in total, 12 games are fully playable with the arcade stick, which means that Pac-Man Museum Plus as a whole is about 85% playable with an arcade stick. This is due to the fact that these games were either developed with joysticks and buttons in mind, or for the case of console games, have a universal control scheme that naturally lends itself to joysticks and buttons. If you still want to play Pac-Land with an arcade stick, get the Arcade Archives release for either Switch or PS4, since that version lets you remap the buttons. Alright, I guess that'll be all for this video. Thank you for watching.